I'm going to give each of the speakers, we've got 3 speakers so far who I'll introduce as their time to speak comes up. They're going to speak for 10 minutes each to give you a little bit of an introduction as to what's going on in their own country and also their analysis of coronavirus and what it means for us on the left. We may be joined by one other speaker, we're waiting to see. But after the 10 minutes is up, then we welcome questions. And indeed, if you want to start posting questions in the box, then you're very welcome to do that. And I think we're going to be able to call you to actually put your questions to the panelists after they finish speaking, technology permitting. But in any case, we will definitely make sure that they're answering your questions. So I'm going to start with Julia Blunck, who is a Brazilian writer and activist. It's very early in the morning for you, Julia, so I'm really pleased that you've joined us today. Thank you very much. Over to you for 10 minutes, and I'll come in at the end to tell you when your time's up.
Okay. First of all, good morning in my side. I guess on your side it must be like afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I apologize for any shortcomings because this is pretty much the first time I've ever done anything similar to this. So I'll start talking a little bit about what's behind Bolsonaro's unusual reaction to coronavirus, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with how he's reacting, he has taken an approach which has been considered very unusual and very wrong by the majority of scientists and experts, in which he constantly diminishes and derides the crisis as merely a flu, nothing bad's going to happen, merely a small issue. So you cannot understand Bolsonaro without understanding the fact that he is at heart a conspiracist. One of his, it's hard to say brains, but one of his main intellectual influences is a man called Olavo de Carvalho, who used to be an astrologist in Brazil, and who then took a different turn, becoming a full-blown conspiracy. And among the things he says are very like the usual forms of conspiracy, which is allegations about human rights activists or about secret homosexual agendas and the desire to destroy the Brazilian family. But he also went into things that are completely out there. So like, even sometimes flirting with like flat Earth conspiracies, and I haven't checked, but I would find very strange if he hasn't posted about the 5G conspiracy. And Olavo de Carvalho is not only an influence, but he's actively an advisor and an important voice in the Bolsonaro government. So this is important because it established that Bolsonaro has a desire to desecrate, and it's hard to put it in any other way, the norms of civilization. And by that I mean, he came into prominence by criticizing Dilma Rousseff during her impeachment trial, where he praised her torture, saying that he was right and that he was voting for her impeach as an homage to her torture. He is a man who believes in violence, not as a means, because the generals in the Brazilian dictatorship between 64 and 84 believed in violence, but they believed it as a means to establish order. He believes in violence as an end and then as a philosophy in itself. But he also believes that things such as human rights, individual rights, knowledge, and science are parts of a huge conspiracy against his own values. So when you look at Bolsonaro's reaction, and if you don't quite understand why he hasn't taken the turn the most authoritarians have taken, It's because his lack of belief in science and his necessity to belittle science are essentially a part. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So those things are essentially a part of him. He believes in science being part of a leftist enemy to him. So the reaction to coronavirus has been so staggeringly out of phase with the rest of the world because of that belief. Because majority of authoritarians saw in the crisis a chance to step up and ramp up their powers. Bolsonaro saw in the crisis a chance to mock science itself. But coronavirus isn't just a Bolsonaro problem. Like in most countries, it is a structural problem that affects structural issues in Brazil. Brazil has been troubled by years and years of austerity. It implemented severely austere measures since 2014. It started with the Dilma Rousseff government, but after she was couped because her impeachment lacked legitimacy in my eyes, because she was couped, because she was, sorry, I saw the message, I lost it. Because she was couped, those measures were wrapped up by quite a lot by the Temer, and then the hyper neoliberal, like, as in actually like the Chicago boy style neoliberal beliefs of Paulo Guedes, who is currently Bolsonaro's finance minister. Bolsonaro claims that a lot of like his concerns are with the economy, and that's certainly true. There is a very big risk for Brazil, who had started to like recover from the past years of crisis, to retreat to levels that like have never been seen in a long time. But it is important to emphasize that Bolsonaro's concerns are not because he believes that like money will lead to like a better social status and a better Brazilian economy and so forth. What he believes when he says that is because he knows that he has been elected by an alliance of the immoral and the amoral. He was elected by the very, very rich in Brazil, who bought their influence in every way they could. And he was elected by the very, very conservative types who believed in one way or another the things that they were saying. They might not be so blunt as him, but they believed him. The issue with coronavirus is that alliance starts to fray. Some people, managers and upper managers and business and such, have started to see Bolsonaro as untamable, because many of them had seen him as tameable. When he takes actions such as firing his health minister in the middle of a pandemic, what they see is that they cannot control this man. And this is also true for Congress. The Brazilian Congress is usually ruled by this amorphous coalition called the Centrão, which is meant to be the center. And this is not an ideology as much as is like an undefined mass of congressmen who are willing to vote with or against the government, depending on what's in it for them. However, Bolsonaro is a very bad political operator. So that has created the issue that Congress and governors have to take charge and address the issue of coronavirus in Brazil. So they have to like do their own economic packages. They have to pass laws that allow for a better lockdown. They have to like look at wider issues. So you have an issue of government, and Bolsonaro constantly attacks Congress and the Senate, almost as if he's daring them to impeach him. This is a big issue because it adds political instability to a very heated situation. It's worth mentioning that the governors in Brazil who are taking charges are not from the left. In fact, most of them are right-wing, and I would say either like softly authoritarian or outright authoritarians who were elected on an anti-workers' party wave to help Bolsonaro's agenda. However, he has miscalculated this to such an extent that he has lost every support that he could get from these governors, and he has lost support in Congress. But it is worth mentioning that he's not completely isolated. And while there has been like a popular, stand against him, you started to hear upper middle class. So the neighborhood I am in is upper middle class, and we had 30 days sustained of protesting against him in the form of pot banging in the windows at about 8:30. He still has a very like core basis, and those people usually are either retired or active military policemen who have access to arms, who many of them are in armed militias who control the neighborhoods of Rio and other cities. And should things escalate to this point, which at the moment I don't think they will, they could represent a real threat of violence. So what you have with coronavirus is a society that is not ready because of structural problems caused by years and years of certain economical priorities, and because of like a political issue where you essentially don't know where the punishment for electing Bolsonaro will come from, but it will come soon. It's a very large like panel of like issues in Brazil, because everywhere you look there is a vulnerable population. The plight of the Amazon is very important to mention. The very poor conditions in prisons, the homelessness population, and the issues of overcrowded favelas. It seems to me that Brazil and the left need to find a way to like fight back against it, but there has been no voice in Brazil from the left to do so. So the challenge for the Brazilian left is to find a way to communicate to people who they are, why it's important, and how they're different from the others. Is that my time? Sorry.
Yeah, that's about time now. Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
No, not at all. It was very clear. Thank you very, very much. And I just want to say from all of us, solidarity to you in Brazil, who have been facing just the most awful time from this president, and you can't really imagine a worse time to have such a president. I mean, like Trump, but worse is what I always is how I always think of Bolsonaro. But what you said is really interesting as well in terms of how the right is coming up with very different approaches to this around the world, with Bolsonaro being at one extreme. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure we're going to have many questions for you, and many thanks coming on the chat for you now. Thanks, Julia. I'm going to turn now, if I can, to Trevor Ngwane. Trevor, an old friend of mine who I haven't seen since the anti-globalization days, but a South African socialist and anti-apartheid activist. Really happy to see you again, Trevor. You're looking very well. And over to you for 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, it's great to be here. Well, South Africa, you know, as you mentioned in your introduction, African countries are still at the early stages of the virus. So at the moment, there's 2,783 people who have tested positive in South Africa, with 50 deaths. So 50 people have died. And then the rate of infection is expected to rise. We are in the middle of a 21-day lockdown, which last week was extended by another 2 weeks. The South African government has been praised internationally, you know, you can imagine, for its quick and decisive action in the face of the virus, especially the lockdown. The man heading the government response is the health minister, Dr. Mkhize, who is a medical doctor and, you know, let's say a good bourgeois politician. So the ideological approach by the government, it has managed to hegemonize the response. The political parties, all political parties are behind the government, supporting the national effort. There is that fear. In fact, when this whole thing started, there was this big fear, anxiety, that the virus will overwhelm us as a country, as a society. The working class and the left organizations, the movement, has been slow to develop its own response. And in fact, when this whole thing started, everyone was behind the government, or they just kept quiet. Now, it is clear that the government's approach has tended to exclude movements, grassroots organizations, and the government has been more talking to capital. You know, the response has been done in partnership with the private sector. Although there is rhetoric, you know, the unions must support us, grassroots organizations must support us. It's also clear that austerity and neoliberal policies continue. So, for example, we can see continuation with attacks on our state-owned enterprises. We're trying to save our state-owned enterprises like our Airways company. Also, the government is busy breaking agreements with unions which were made before the lockdown. And it is clear to us, especially on the left, that some of the solutions or responses to Corona require alternative policies, many which must be anti-neoliberal and even anti-capitalist. So, for example, to be fair to the government, but which underlines my point, last week the government announced that it is taking over water provision in the country totally, and also away from private water producers. So it's centralizing water provision to ensure that there is a smooth, efficient provision of water, which it should have done, you know, many years ago. Because of time, the approach is enforcement-based. So the government mobilized the army and police, to enforce the lockdown. All this is happening within a very unequal society, So, like all so-called acts of God, the poor, the vulnerable, the working classes tend to suffer more. So basically, you find that, just to summarize my point, where the government is coming up with good solutions, we can criticize them for being temporary solutions to permanent problems. So let's take, for example, the example of the shack settlements. About 9 million people out of over 50 million population, 9 million people live in shanty towns, in shacks. So suddenly, these people are getting a lot of attention. Oh, the shack settlements, poor conditions. But we know, of course, the fear is that the virus will really run amok there. For example, the people are not able to exercise social distancing because it's overcrowded. They can't really wash their hands properly because there's not proper access to water. So, that shows that there's a need really for proper houses for people. What the government has done, it is building new temporary shelters, trying to de-densify the shack settlements. The homeless, people living in the street, are being taken off and are being housed in shelters. There is also a problem of food. So there's distribution of food parcels. There's some complaints. For example, migrants from other countries are being denied food. There's also complaints about police and army brutality when they are busy enforcing the lockdown. So they'll stop you in the street. What are you doing here? And then sometimes they might kick you around. About 9 people have died in the course of the lockdown, and a few of these deaths are related directly to police and army brutality. But we can't be definitive because investigations are still going on. Now I'll come to worker rights. There's a problem here because about 5.5 million informal workers, this includes street traders, have been stopped from plying their trade. So they are suffering. Although last week, due to pressure, this has been relaxed. So now informal traders must get a permit. There are long queues for permits. The right to strike is being compromised. Remember that according to the lockdown laws, only essential service workers, essential workers are allowed to work. But this also include, retail sector workers, those selling food in big supermarkets. So because our labor laws restrict the right to strike if you're an essential worker, so these workers are not really able to stand up and fight for their rights. Last week, a big supermarket chain, Pick and Pay, fired workers who tried to stand up and say, hey, what about PPE, protective equipment? What about money? There is also a shortage of PPE, personal protective equipment, for health workers, which is worrying. And then 3 private sector hospitals have stopped new admissions because up to 50, 60 healthcare workers have tested positive. Just to round off with organization, there's been a coalition, the COVID-19 People's Coalition, which was formed in mid-March, and it consists of a number of working groups, workers' rights, healthcare. It's struggling with resources. There's also the problem of lack of mobility. Activists can't move around. But there is that call for mobilization. Demands include income security for all. People don't have food. Also, permanent solutions like one universal healthcare service for all. And then all the demands you can imagine, mass screening, et cetera, et cetera. Also end to police brutality. So in general, I would say, like I say, the solutions are temporary, but the problems are permanent. And, we're hoping that the working class, the movements can mobilize and look beyond, the immediate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trevor. I'm so interested about the public water provision, because of course this was something we were fighting for 20 years ago. It's been a problem for 20 years, and all of a sudden it's very interesting how governments can pull these solutions, which we've been calling for a very long time. And as you say, how we preserve some of these victories, even from neoliberal governments, is one of the key things we're all thinking about at the moment in response to COVID. So final speaker, I think now, is Oscar Guardiola Rivera, author of What If Latin America Ruled the World? And I think, Oscar, you're based in Colombia, in Bogota. I think that's where you are at the moment, if I'm not mistaken. To you.
I'm not in Colombia at the moment. I'm in London at the moment. So let me say hello to Londoners as well as Colombians, and to shout out at some of our attendees, people like Mary Caldor, Nicolo Milanese, Naira Bello, whose work in activism and theory is very helpful to us all. There are 3 points I would like to develop this afternoon after I have shown my gratitude to Another Europe is Possible for this invitation. The first point has to do with the opportunities as well as challenges for both the left and the right in Latin America. Or the Americas in general, if you prefer, given that the Americas is right now the site of a sort of low-intensity conflict. The second point that I would like to develop has more to do with Colombia specifically. It has to do with the situation in Colombia, and more particularly the situation in the border between Colombia and Venezuela. For obvious geostrategical reasons, that border has become more and more important. The third and final point that I would like to develop today has to do with let's say the challenge, the ultimate challenge that this pandemic throws to us all. So let me begin with the first point. Challenges and opportunities. Let us not forget that the immediate context of the breakout of this pandemic in the Americas has to do with the various massive protests that had taken place throughout the Americas until the end of 2019 at the very least, which in fact were continuing in places like Colombia, Ecuador, Chile, also Bolivia, throughout January and February. This is very important. Take, for instance, the cases of Colombia and Chile, the most conservative, the most right-wing, if you prefer, governments in the entire Western Hemisphere. even in the sense that they may have been the ones who had inspired the likes of Trump and Bolsonaro. I refer to such right-wing populist leaders as Álvaro Uribe Vélez in Colombia, and or of course Piñera in Chile. Both in the case of Colombia and in the case of Chile, Iván Duque, the president of Colombia, who everybody deems a bit of a puppet of Uribe Vélez and his far right-wing party, the paradoxically called Democratic Center, has lost, the trust of the Colombian people. Some of you might remember how in November and throughout December there were huge mass strikes and demonstrations in the streets of Bogota, as well as the other cities of Colombia, protests that were mirrored or resonated with similar protests taking place in Chile, where also Piñera, the president of Chile, had all sorts of difficulties to contain this wave of popular discontent. In fact, right before the beginning of the crisis, or the official beginning of the crisis, if you like, the popularity of a president like Iván Duque in Colombia was well below 10%, in some cases 7%, even 4%, which of course, and similarly in the case of Piñera in Chile, which of course means that in 2 years' time, when elections happen again, there is every indication that the far right-wing parties could be in danger of losing the grip that they had sustained in power for a very long time. In the case of Colombia, of course, this happens in the midst of a peace process that the far right has done everything to upset, and ditto in the case of Chile. In the case of Chile, in fact, the popular wave of protest gave place to a call for a constitutional convention, which is a hugely interesting and important development. Think about what would be the case if in the countries of Northern Europe, a popular movement ends up pushing the government towards calling a convention that would allow for the rewriting or the writing, in the case of the United Kingdom, of a new constitution, thereby reforming radically all the institutions of government. Well, that's exactly where we were at right before the beginning of the crisis in places like Colombia and Chile. In the case of Mexico, for instance, also a very important player in the region, and I'm not going to talk about Brazil because Julia has done so very well already. You remember that the leftist party, the coalition known as Morena, had won the election, and Andrés Manuel López Obrador had launched the so-called Fourth Transformation Project. Hugely important, geostrategically speaking, in the region. So, to the point, what are the opportunities and what are the challenges? Well, the first challenge has to do precisely with the fact that any kind of mass protest, of mass political mobilization, has to happen in the streets. And as in most parties of the left throughout Latin America, including Morena, who is now in power in Mexico, are party movements, which is to say that they depend very much on people striking in the streets. Also, this was very interesting because the protests that we saw late last year in these three countries and others were putting a lot of pressure on the financial markets, which is to say people had understood that if they were to remain with constancy in the streets, they would be creating a kind of risk to the financiers of their countries, so that these financiers would be readier to pay a premium, money right now with which to fund projects for grander justice. That was the aim of these protests. Well, that has now stopped. because people had to go back to their homes and are being isolated. So that means, and this is the second challenge, that most of the political conflict has now been displaced to a different space, the virtual space, the space of media. And here, the opportunities for the far right, and we have to be very careful about it. You can already see how in places like Mexico, fake news and all sorts of media-driven projects have been launched by the far right in order to criticize and, if possible, unseat left-wing governments such as that of AMLO in Mexico, and or stop the wave of protests that were taking place in Colombia and in Chile. In fact, if you look at the situation now in Chile, you will see how Piñera has taken this opportunity to pretty much militarize the entire country. Something very similar has happened in the case of Colombia, where the protest has lost momentum, and indeed that seems to be the conflict right now. That is to say, on the one hand, the left and the social movements have to very quickly transform their strategies for protest in the streets into strategies for protesting also in the media. Let me move very quickly to the second and the third point. The second point has to do with, it's like zooming into the situation in Colombia. And in Colombia, of course, you see two things. On the one hand, the continuation of assassinations of social leaders, and on the other hand, a renewed support for the possibility of regime change in Venezuela. And this, of course, has to do with a new push by the Trump administration to try and create further instability in the region. Of course, what Trump wants to do is to recover the dominance that the United States had in the hemisphere, which it had lost because of the pink wave of leftist governments that dominated the hemisphere during the first decade and a half of this century. And so, of course, you all saw how the Trump administration mobilized the Navy and, in fact, may have already sent some troops via the Colombian border into Venezuela. In fact, I mean, those of us who had been overseeing the border already knew that the far-right Colombian paramilitary was already training units to fight in the Venezuelan border. We heard very recently news, which remain unconfirmed at present, because this is also another problem. The mainstream media are not informing. They're only talking about COVID-19 in very abstract ways. And there seems to be a problem with the presence of military personnel in the border. So finally, what is the ultimate question that COVID-19 is throwing at us? Let us put it in the style of old Westerns, la bolsa o la vida, as we say in Spanish, capital or life. The discussion in Latin America right now is whether or not lives should be sacrificed in order to, inverted commas, save the economy, which is why we see loads of movement by governments in Colombia and in Chile to restart normality or business as usual. And of course, that throws huge challenges, because as the previous speakers have mentioned, in countries in the global south, a increasing majority or a considerable number of people live in the informal economy. They cannot isolate. If mass transport finishes, then these people are in trouble to earn any livelihood. At the same time, they're being put in this position precisely because of decades after decades of defunding and privatizations, particularly of the health service, which continue to put millions of lives in danger. Of course, most countries in Latin America are 2 to 3 weeks behind developments in the United States and or Europe. But the risk is immense that if these governments go back to business as usual, these will mean precisely the renewal of a sacrificial economy in which the many are continued to be sacrificed for the benefit of the very few. Let me leave it there and thank you very much.